Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Madeline Fitzgerald, and I am the manager of adult programs here at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. On behalf of the museum, I would especially like to welcome and thank our members who are watching this evening. It is because of your generosity that our collection and our special exhibitions are free and open to everyone. If you are not currently a member, I encourage you to join by visiting our website, cartermuseum.org. And though programming is currently all happening virtually, I want to mention that the Carter is open, although we aren't actually open today because of the severe winter weather Fort Worth is having. But we are continuing to operate at a limited capacity, and we require masks for everyone to enter the museum. If you have not been to the Carter since we reopened earlier this summer, I strongly encourage you to come by and check out the museum. We have two incredible exhibitions on view currently: Mythmakers, The Art of Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington, and the subject of tonight's talk, Mitch Epstein, Property Rights. Both of these shows will close on February 28th, so you don't want to miss them. I'd like to invite you to an upcoming program happening virtually at the Carter. Our next experts talk on the Carter lecture will be Thursday, February 25th at 6 p.m., and that's Central Time. Experts Talk on the Carter, or etc. for short, is a monthly lecture series that occurs January through April, and it's an opportunity to hear experts in our community talk about artworks in our collection, often from a non-art perspective. This month, we will learn about the art of change with two experts who are working to help our community reconcile with our city's, state, and country's past. Dr. Frederick Gooding Jr., assistant professor in the Honors College at Texas Christian University and chair of the Race and Reconciliation Initiative at TCU, will share his expertise on how our past can inform our present actions. And Thomas Wilson Mitchell, professor at Texas A&M University School of Law and recent winner of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, will share his expertise on helping African-American families become property owners. All of the experts talk on the Carter lectures are free this spring, and you can reserve a spot for this talk, which again is held on February 25th by going to this link that I'm putting in the chat right now. And like I said, it's happening February 25th at 6 p.m. This evening, though, we are joined by the Carter's Senior Curator of Photographs, John Rohrbach, and photographer Mitch Epstein. After their conversation, we are going to do a Q&A session. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Zoom webinar format, you can submit a question by using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, or if you're on an iPad, I believe it's on the top. Feel free to submit questions throughout the program, and we will do our best to cover as many as we can at the end of their talk. And if you have any questions or problems during the program, please use the chat function to reach out to me. I'm going to turn off my camera because you don't need to see my face, but I will be there and I can help you out as much as I can. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest tonight. Mitch Epstein is a photographer who helped pioneer fine art color photography in the 1970s. His photographs are in numerous major museum collections, including New York's Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, as well as the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Tate Modern in London, and last but certainly not least, the Carter. His new series, Property Rights, was exhibited at Sekema Jenkins and Company in New York and Gallery Thomas Zander in Cologne in the fall of 2019. But the Carter's exhibition is the first time the works have been shown together in a museum setting. He's had many solo exhibitions across the United States and Europe and has published 13 books. In 2011, Epstein won the Prix Pictet for his work, American Power. He's also awarded the 2008 Berlin Prize in Arts and Letters by the American Academy in Berlin, and he was awarded a 2003 Guggenheim Fellowship. Mitch and John, thank you both for joining us this evening to talk about the stunning exhibition, Property Rights.
Thank you, Madeline. And thank you, Mitch, for joining us tonight. Before I get into asking you a few questions about property rights, I just want to share something that I don't think we've really talked about. And that's that I first took note of your photography and your art when I came upon your book, Family Business, which you published in 2003. And I felt you were so brave to take on your father as a subject, that it's something that I couldn't do or am not able to do yet. And you presented him in this full complexity with a directness, but also a sensitivity and a sympathy that was really quite remarkable and unusual. And then when you followed that up with American Power, to me, that was a different kind of bravery. Photographing power plants and refineries and things like that in the aftermath of 9/11 took on two issues. One is these kinds of companies don't like people prowling around outside them with cameras. They don't like to be photographed by the general public. And the country was up in arms at that point. People were nervous about who was lurking around, who was photographing whom in public spaces, and so on and so forth. Yet you came out with quite a lyrical book. And so that was a surprise and a pleasure. And then you surprised me again. You switched tacks by dealing with the centrality of New York's natural environment. And I lived in New York for a short period of time. But I grew up in the country, so the parks and the trees and nature were really crucial to me while I was in New York. But you acknowledged New Yorkers' own deep connection with that natural environment through that book. And the museum's ownership of the Weeping Beach is great because it's a perfect example of that connection of history and life weaving together. And so it's a great fit for our kind of collection. I do appreciate the fact that you're coming to talk to us tonight about property rights. And one thing that's cognizant to me is that it really takes on a similar, very broad definition of a subject, like you do in American Power, where you're not only photographing gasoline refineries or electricity plants and things like that, or not merely industrial might or American global political power, but you're photographing the human side of these kinds of issues. Neighborhoods and schools up cheek to jowl with power plants and oil plants. Also the fear that people had during that period of time, that sense of an unsettled world, much like we have today. And now you're dealing with conflict over land rights and land use. And before I get into some of those issues with you, I wanted to step back and ask you a much more broad question. Because when I talk to artists, I'm always curious about how they find their projects, how they decide at the very beginning what's going to be interesting to them and sort of test ideas to come to and bring it together into a series. So maybe you can tell me how you found this particular project.
Well, I could speak generally. First, thank you, John, for the kind introduction to my work over the last 20 years, and Madeline, too, for your gracious welcome, and to the museum for having honored my work with this beautiful show. I am deeply appreciative. I don't really choose my projects, they choose me. Although I think my work at large has a strong conceptual basis. My projects are not something that I think up in my head. I have an experience out in the world, and generally I bring it home with me from wherever it's happened. In this case, I had two experiences that I think led to the genesis of the project. I first went with my wife to protest and be participant to the Women's March the day after President Trump was inaugurated. And that stirred up in me feelings that I think brought me back to my resistance to the Vietnam War as a young man. I came back to New York. Days later, Donald Trump reneged on the environmental review by the Army Corps of Engineers of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I had been following what was taking place over the past year at the Standing Rock Resistance Action. And so I just got on a plane in the middle of winter in February and went and had a experience that that made me ask questions of myself, of my country, of my work. I made pictures, I did interviews with many of the elders, in particular matriarchal elders, which gave me another way to think about our long relationship as Americans to the colonization of the United States. So it was really in part specific to the resistance of this pipeline action, but there were so many things at stake. And so when I got back to my studio, it stayed with me, it gnawed at me. And I began then to think in a more kind of critical, intellectual way about how I might proceed and undertake this project. I mean, do you think I could have thought up, for instance, in my head here that I maybe would do a project about my father? I would have I would have gone back to therapy first. You know, it was just things happened to my father in his life, and I was called up to come and see if I could help, and there was nothing I could do. But I realized that it was important for me to be there and to summon the courage. So I think that answers your question, I hope.
So when you went up to the protests at Standing Rock that first time, did you bring a camera? Did you bring your view camera?
I brought my 8x10 view camera. I also brought a video camera and a sound recorder. And so I did go with the expectation that I would make pictures, but I had no idea what they might be. And the experience itself was very harsh. I mean, you yourself have described the weather today in Fort Worth. Well, it was below zero with, 30, 40 mile an hour gusting winds when I got to Standing Rock. And so the experience was severe. And maybe that was also useful because I had to find a way to get inside the teepees and tents and different places that people were residing that had been there, some of them for 6 months, 9 months. And so it was a lot about listening that sort of led the way. I made pictures. I was also nervous because it was when law enforcement was beginning to, encroach more aggressively on the camps. They were shut down only weeks later. So there was this sort of, there was this anxiety in the air because of that. And also I was an outsider. And it took a great deal to just get myself in, to convince those that were controlling the camps that my intentions were sincere, that I was respectful. And so there was a kind of navigation, a diplomacy that took place. And I didn't, I didn't differ with that, but it took some effort.
And there must have been other photographers there. Doing the same
there
thing.
weren't so many photographers at that point. In a way, it was really sort of past its prime in terms of the action. There was under 1,000 people between all the camps, maybe quite a bit less. People were caught a bit off guard because in December, the resistance action really, they took a breath because President Obama had stopped the construction of the pipeline. So it caught everybody a bit by surprise. And so when I come into an environment like that, I really just spend a lot of time looking and listening and letting myself respond intuitively. I don't have the ideas for pictures in my head. And so, you know, it's uncharted in some way.
Do you often find you have to go back a couple of times to a place to
I
get your bearings?
frequently go back, but in this case, it was a one-shot opportunity. Although I did go back, but there was one shot, as in, you know, during the actual resistance action, it was over. And when I went back a year later to photograph and participate in a prayer walk, which commemorated the actions, I went to the sites, and they were repatriated back to really what they were. There was no evidence whatsoever that there had been anything there. No physical evidence. So
perhaps we can show that prayer walk image, Madeline. Do you think that's possible?
Yes, pulling it up right now.
Great.
2 seconds.
John, you know, you asked me about my relationship to the Homer Remington show, which I haven't seen, but have had a chance to look at the catalog. And I think this picture actually, in some ways, relates to a Homer painting in its simplicity, in how the elements are really reduced to the most essential. So here, and this is an exception because most of the work for this series was done with an 8x10 camera, but this prayer walk I photographed with a digital hand camera. There was really no way that I could keep up with the walk, and I didn't want the pictures to be staged. I wanted them to be spontaneous. So here you see this contingent of prayer walkers walking parallel to the Missouri River, which is at the distance. And I had the photographic grace of arresting their movement at this conjunction of having 3 figures and 2 on the left, 2 on the right, where the eye can lead down this open road that leads you to the Missouri River, which was a focal point for the DAPL protest because the pipeline was going underneath the river. So, you know, a picture like this, there'd be no way that I could ever have some idea of it in my head. It was really about responding in a very athletic, spontaneous way and trying to make a picture that would in some way embody or evoke the purposefulness, the determination, the ritual that's in part articulated through those prayer flags on the staff that the leader, Nathan Phillips, is holding, and so many details. The peace sign on the red hoodie, the upside down flag of distress, this idea of movement, the movement of a community that is displaced and yet still purposefully out there fighting their fight.
It's interesting that you say that because my first response to the photograph, when I think I saw it in your studio, was to the landscape. Mm-hmm. That road pulls me straight back into that semi-empty space. Mm-hmm. And I come and dwell in that broad, open landscape, just like those people. Mm. And it's only when I come to terms with the landscape and with the fact that it's snowing and that I'm sure it's bitter cold from the size of the snowflakes, that I come back and join this sort of frieze of people walking across the front of the picture plane.
Yeah. Part of the beauty for me of how we read photographs is that we all come to them, with our own eyes and our own, free sets of associations. That is the beauty of it. I think that I could make that if I can make a picture that has multiple entrance points, that I think, I'm working in the right direction. For me, it's about how to create a kind of tension, a formal tension, where I'm wrestling content in form into a resolved, place, which feels irreducible. And so it's very, there's a lot of, as I said, grace with a picture like this, which happens in a thousandth of a second. With, in my case, a 65-year-old man, probably my heart was beating too fast as I ran to get to that vantage and then made pictures. And that's really what that walk was. So it was kind of thrilling. I come from a background of having used a hand camera for 30 years. And I think that having switched tools and moved to a large format camera and then at times back to a hand camera, they've both informed my practice in ways that has enabled me with the hand camera to assert a kind of formal authority in the work, and with the large format camera that's to some degree more cumbersome and involves more predetermination of the craft of making a picture. At the same time, I allow for the serendipitous, for the things that occur that I can still stop at 125th of a second. That could be a dog walking into the picture, for instance.
And in this case, every face is turned away, except perhaps the last person where you see part of her face as she's looking forward. Also creates a sort of broad energy to the scene. It takes it out of a strict momentary document of an instant and gives it a sort of a broader sense of time.
Yes, I appreciate that in some ways it's very much located in the present, but it's an extended present.
So I want to come back to your use of the view camera, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge that this is an image, again, that you took a year later, and ask you to talk about some of the images that you made on your first, your time there while the encampment was still in existence.
Okay. Should we go to the next slide then? Or
if we can go to the next slide.
Please. So this was an image, it's called Veterans Respond flag. It's, there were multiple camps. This was made at the Sacred Stone camp. And there was a contingent of veterans that had come to give support to those that remained at the resistance action. They hung this flag. In fact, before I saw upside down flags, I did not myself know that an upside down American flag is a traditional military symbol of distress. And it didn't occur to me to, initially make this picture, but I did make a scout shot with my phone camera, and I was struck by how sculptural the flag was in that, winter plains wind, and also just how kind of just jerry-rigged, how vulnerable it was at the focal point of the duct tape at 2 points holding it. And also how beautiful it was as an object set against the ground of that winter blue sky with just a little bit of the white snowy landscape out of focus. And then too, when you look closely on the lower left, you see that there's just a wire that's kind of holding it to a trailer or some kind of a storage place. So, you know, again, maybe it's I think how simple and reductive it is, and that here again it's a call out for distress, and yet the thing itself is really very, very, very beautiful and very reverential.
Well, it's also very powerful. It asks you to respond quite directly and in some ways take a stance to what it's saying.
I think what's important is that there can be an idea or many ideas that are embodied in the picture, but it's still essential for me to figure out how to make a picture that's going to, through its clarity and purposefulness as a visual object, attain enigma. And I think that's maybe what you're alluding to here. And so again, this was tricky because I made several frames, but as you can see by the wind, I didn't know what the pictures were going to look like until I got back to my studio and had the film processed. Maybe the next slide. So here I'm at the security gate for the Rosebud encampment. And so this was a picture, again, it's late in the resistance action. And there was a security attendant and then a Native American who was also living in the camp that showed up, and it's a water protector and Native American. And this picture is it's more or less making something out of what to me looked almost like an installation with all these elements that have been maybe used, discarded, the old solar panel, but there was something very loving in the way things were made. The water is life. It's Miniwikoni. That was kind of the mantra of the Standing Rock Resistance action. When you look closely, you see it's got these kind of funny rubber ducky patterns on the letters, or that sled on the left, which was used to carry things around in the snow. But for me, it was a lot about that exchange of these two men in repose that felt just very vibrant and spoke to what it really felt like to be there at that point in time. Maybe next.
To me, it's about that extended commitment. One of the things that amazed me about that whole operation was how sustained it was. It ran at least 18 months. And this speaks to me quite succinctly about people who are not setting up a permanent existence, but setting up an existence where this is a lived-in space. It's like a campground where a family's been for months at a time. And so it speaks to me about that kind of longevity in all kinds of weather, and particularly that winter weather. You see the wood that's been chopped up, or the stove, and you can see the stovepipes coming up out of the building. I don't really want to call it a house, but and you see the piles of old dirty snow and things like that. So it's, and yet they're hanging out. It reminds me of those catching a bit of warm weather, or catching a bit of sun in the middle of the winter. And the
Yeah.
bright, even light
Mm.
gives me that sensation also.
I think it alludes also to there's a very frontier-like
Yep.
character, and the tools, as you said, the wood stove. There's something very animated about the tarp, the kind of just maybe it's coming from the hot air, the wind. So a picture that's quite still has this kind of implied movement. And then, as you said, it's the waiting. There's just this infinite waiting when you're involved with resistance action. Maybe the next.
Yeah, the next slide, please.
Oh, so I just put this here because I thought, oh, it's interesting to just see, well, stepping back when it's not before the picture, where, because you've asked me at one point, well, what's my process? And it's always different, but inevitably it looks chaotic. And my job is to find order within the chaos. So the first thing I do is I find my vantage point, and oftentimes I end up with a vantage point that's slightly higher than human height, which enables me with the 8x10 to bring in more focus from the near ground to the far. And so, this is what I'm in the midst of here. But in the course of the hour and a half that I made the picture here, the American Indian showed up, and they started a conversation. I had a pack of cigarettes, which helped the conversation to continue, and so on and so forth. So you see here my assistant with like a backpack. I've got my film holders in there. There's a lot of stuff to contend with. Maybe we go to the next slide, though.
Before we do that, let me just ask why you're working with a view camera in the time when we all can use our phones or use these portable cameras. And I think of the view camera time as that point in not only the 19th century, but the 1970s, the mid 70s, when suddenly the photo world moved from street photography to view camera work.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's switched again. But what is that allure of the view camera for you, and the 8x10 in particular?
I think that I really appreciate what feels more truly like a blank slate when I go to set up the camera and look at the ground glass and see how malleable the three-dimensional space in front of me can be ordered and reduced and to 2 dimensions photographically. So I have more control with focus, and to build a picture that also I can make into a large mural print, where I can control the rendering of detail, the acuity of things. Also, it slows me up. I make less pictures. I spend more time making fewer pictures and looking deeply at what's at hand. And so when I make the commitment to bring the camera out, set it up and make a picture, generally I follow through and really work that situation. So, you know, I'm very vested in my work as prints. And I still prefer the tonal rendering of negative, especially with an 8x10. I mean, digital has remarkable qualities, and I use it, as you could see with the prayer walk picture. But with 8x10 color negative film, there is something atmospheric that is described, that is captured, that is not there with digital. It almost crosses past that point in its radical sharpness of description. And you know, here I think at Standing Rock, it was beautifully you know, kind of disarming, because it's people, I think, respect the view camera. It's archaic. Obviously, there's a whole other kind of commitment. You're not just shooting and run, you know, in the way sometimes photojournalism requires. It's just what it is. So with doing a portrait or a picture like this, I find that I get cooperation from strangers, and a kind of generous cooperation, which is helpful. So I just think it affords a different kind of picture. Every tool and material sets up its own limitations in terms of conditions for what you can do with it. And I came late to the 8x10, and I just feel that I can build pictures that are a distillation of larger experience, even though they're dealing with the specificity of what it is that I'm actually photographing.
I love your notion of building a picture, but it makes me think of your film work early on in your career, which we really haven't talked about, because it raises the question, are you a director or are you a documenter? Oh,
I would, if I had to choose between the two, I would sign on to director, although I don't feel like I have to assert myself, my artistic, you know, sort of my production in that way. But I do think that it does, you know, I draw on documentary tradition, and I have, you know, benefited so much from the study of what might be more strict documentary photography. But for instance, if I was doing a commission for the New York Times Magazine, and I went about doing what I did here, it would cross the line, because I'm editing what's in front of the camera in a way that is making it not, well, you know, strictly documentary. And it's not to say that other documentary photographers haven't done that along the way. But if I have to do that when I have my negative and I'm working on the image in Photoshop, because there's something that's distracting, you know, so say there was a branch coming in, or some piece of detritus that I found was taking away, I'll reduce those elements. I mean, I'm not doing a lot of that, but I feel that I want that license. I think to be an artist today, a photographer, a photographic artist, you have to be a director, because you have to take responsibility for so much more than making the pictures. It's how do you contextualize them if you do an you know, if you think you're going to do an exhibition or to do a book or what have you. And in this case also, so much work goes into just getting to make the pictures. That takes direction. Maybe some of it is producing too.
Yeah, you have to take responsibility from one end to the other. All the way through to how it's presented, whether it be in book form or exhibition form, on how people think about the series. So I'm a little bit cognizant of time, and I have a number of questions, but I just want to get back to that notion of your title, property rights,
Mm.
and ask where that title comes from.
Can we just change another slide, since this was kind of like a
Yeah.
kind of a throwaway that I just put in there? So this one is a little bit challenging to, I will address the property rights question, but let me just show this and then move, and then I'll pause and respond to your questions. So, but this image, this one is a key one, and one that really depends on its scale as a 70 by 90 inch print. And I was interested in making a picture that would really truly be a distillation of the standoff between the resistance activists and the construction itself of the pipeline and the law enforcement that was set up. So if you go to the next slide, this was very handily done by my studio manager, Ryan Spencer, who was with me on this trip. And it's in a larger print, you see on all these hillsides, these kind of defense posts that were protecting the drilling pad and all the construction that was going on. So you have two rivers in between, and also you have Turtle Island, which really is a metaphor for Turtle Island at large, which was the Lakota ancestral, their and larger ancestral lands before colonization. But you see with the view camera from a taller vantage, I may be able to put together a picture where I can bring in focus and, across the river, it's about 2 miles away, and create that kind of tension and deep space and deep conceptual space as well. But this is so detail rich. It's a kind of meditation also on the architecture of resistance. If you see the Mongolian huts, the teepees, the Frank Gehry-like structures, the bunkers, and so on. It's a picture that you can spend time with. And that's what I'm trying to do. Let's go to the next slide. What is the next one? And then I can talk about the title. All right, so this is a good one because it also speaks to my process. I didn't come up with property rights. I have a dear friend who's a brilliant essayist, Elliot Weinberger. And he's kind of a title meister. I tell him what I'm doing, and within 2 minutes, he tells me what the title should be. And he's done this probably 4 or 5 times in ways that have stuck. And at first I thought property rights, it sounds so legal. I'm not sure. But what was to me thrilling was to live with the title and to see the ways in which I could expand the meaning of it over the course of working on this project. So here you're looking at a map. This is a map that's put together by Ryan, who I mentioned, my studio manager, who's done at this point extensive research on sites that relate to the theme of land, property rights, different kinds of conflicts, all the way from the southwestern border of the United States and Mexico to other pipeline resistance actions, so on and so forth. What that enables me to do is to dig into the research deeply. If I'm going to an area, to a region that's to photograph a couple specific sites, I also know I have other options at hand that I might consider if things don't pan out. So there's a lot of work that goes into leading up to doing a project like this. That's it's not exhaustive, and it's totally idiosyncratic. It's not academic. It never could be, but it's really useful. So maybe the next slide, and then we can. So, and also just to give um, a view of, you can see here the scale. There's 2 or 3 views of the interior of the exhibition. Maybe the next slide, and just to see where we get.
Yeah, just to remind people, many of these images are 70 by 90 inches. So you can get a sense of the scale if you think in those terms. They're really quite amazing in terms of their size and their sharpness and beauty.
Thank you.
They're enveloping to me. In other words, I come up and the gallery disappears around it as I stand close to them and I start to go into the detail of those images.
Maybe there's one more I think we have from here too. That's the thing. Okay. So maybe I turn it back to you.
Yeah, I just want to share with you what I first thought about when I thought of the term property rights, because I think you had that title when you first started showing me images.
Mhm.
And I thought of that sort of very uneven, wobbly balance between private rights and public needs, that public dimension. And I immediately go back to my sort of classical training, and I think of Plato and Aristotle and their arguments back and forth about whether there should be private property. Plato saying that private property gets in the way of a just society, and his student Aristotle basically saying that private property brings a vested interest in society and makes for good citizens. And I started looking at the images in terms of that kind of conflict, in terms of government abilities or corporate abilities to commandeer land for pipelines and things like that. But I quickly realized as I was looking through the range of images that it was broader than that. It certainly was about a society out of balance, but it was about property rights in the sort of broadest sense. And that's where, if you could just show a couple of other slides of other images in the exhibition or in the series, and talk a little bit about your encounters with these places or these events or these people.
Let's go to the next slide, please. Again, forward. Okay, so after Standing Rock, I learned of a resistance action in Western Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. And I was surprised when I went out to meet the leaders of Lancaster Against Pipelines to see how the people there that were meeting up on a Saturday on farmland that had been given to them or loaned to them to set up a meeting site were just like me. These were middle class white people of relative privilege whose land was under threat by eminent domain takeover by a pipeline company that was Oklahoma, Texas based, that was going to be carrying natural gas from the shale fields in Western Pennsylvania in pipe made in South Korea to a port in Baltimore to be shipped to Scotland to make plastics. And this really people's, had their doors knocked on, and, and all of a sudden this community came together because they wanted to protect what they felt was theirs. But I would say the vast majority of them also felt that they were stewards of the land, that they had a profound environmental consciousness. And one of the advantages of, of spending time and participating in this resistance action was that it was only 3.5 hours away. So I might have gone down there 12, 13 times and really gotten to know the clatterbuck. So this image, and one of the things that really interested me was because photography deals with the actual, with what is. And so I have to figure out how to make pictures with the stuff of this world. And so here Ashton Clatterbuck was a young man who grew up with this over 3-4 years of his adolescence. And you see him here with what's called a lockdown device, where he's tied his hands together and locked himself around a tree. So this is a device that he's made really to be used at the actions to tie himself to like a bulldozer, a tractor, to basically halt the construction. But I would say he's as concerned about the contamination that can come from the spill of natural gas and explosion. He's as concerned about the environment, period, about nature. So he offered to tie himself to the tree. So this is really, something that I've set up, but he's emotively involved here in a way that's no different than he was on the actions, absolutely stoic. And so for him, property rights is, it's about protecting something that's larger than all of us. And so in ways that I could touch on these themes that have been gnawing at me really, especially since I did American Power, I wanted to make pictures that struck that chord. Next slide, please.
Before we leave it,
Oh,
the thing that makes, part of what makes this image so amazing to me is his looking straight at the camera, which is a brilliant choice, Mr. Director, because he's looking straight at me in that 70 by 90 inches. He's life size. He is asking me in a way whether I will be involved with him. I will join him. It takes me back to I grew up on a university campus in the 60s, and which went through all of the ups and downs with the demonstrations against the war and civil rights demonstrations and so on. And it takes me not only back to that time, but it also asks me to think about what I do today, what I'm willing to do, what I'm not willing to do, and how much commitment I'm willing to make to these kinds of issues.
I think we get along so well because we really are comrades. We're made of similar stuff, John.
But it raises a question for me before you go on to another image. And that is, what's the viewer's responsibility? What are you asking of the viewer when they see the images in this series?
I'm really asking the viewer to have a very direct engagement with the work on their own terms. The work is, the work. I want the viewer to be moved and provoked by engaging with my work in the same way that I was moved and provoked to even set out on doing this project. So it's not. I don't have an agenda or a message to communicate.
Are you asking them to become activists?
I'm asking the viewer to perhaps let their defense down and to engage and to enter in the work in a way that is part emotional, but part intellectual. But maybe to end up with questions, but also delight. I mean, as you can see with my work, I celebrate beauty. And so even in pictures that are just, describing or depicting certain scenarios that are terrorizing and troubling, beauty is a foil for that terror. Beauty leaves one with, I think, a kind of appreciation and a kind of respect, a regard for what's at hand. And so it's not that simple, but I think that that's an operating force in the work that has a kind of power. So, and I do think you're right. I mean, here, I remember with Ashton, because of my own experience, being on film sets and even having done a performance piece where I had to figure out myself how to perform myself. I remember telling him to put himself back in that place where he had already been arrested by the time I took this picture. So it is a kind of method in acting kind of involvement, which is helpful. I mean, sometimes somebody just assumes a certain look or position and it's just right, but sometimes it has to get it's a collaboration. I think collaboration is another thing that I haven't really spoken about that is absolutely essential to my process. It usually takes teamwork. And I guess maybe that's where there is a director in me, but I've made reference to Ryan, who I've worked closely. I've worked closely with my wife, Susan Bell, as a collaborator, really for more than 25 years. There's a kind of critical discussion. There's a there's a vitality to the work that gets played out in discourse, and it happens too when you're working with an 8x10. It's very performative. Things happen, and I'm working very quickly, but also very. I can't make mistakes. I have to get the focus right. I have to exposure and so on. But I'm trying to make the 8x10 feel like it's a hand camera, and I can be fluid. That takes a team sometimes.
So you've shown a number of images dealing with specific conflicts and people protesting. Could you share an image that is more open-ended or more broadly deals with that theme of property rights and conflict?
Well, let's go to, we can skip ahead. Why don't we just, we can go to, say, the Rushmore. Well, yeah. Maybe the Rushmore picture is good. So it's about.
And then maybe, since we're up in that part of the country, maybe the pony races.
Yeah. So here, you asked me earlier, do I feel the need to revisit sites or places or people that I'm photographing? It wasn't possible to go back and photograph at Standing Rock at the encampments again because they didn't exist. But it was my deeper understanding and attention to the importance of American history and the colonization of the West that led me to go back to the Dakotas and spend time on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and as well go back to Standing Rock and to go to sites that were of special sacred importance to the Lakota Nation. And one site that I thought, oh, this is kind of, like this, like it's like the flag. It's so loaded, Rushmore, too iconic. There's no way I'm going to be able to make a picture that's going to be fresh. That's going to turn it around in some sense. But I went. And arrived on a day where it was kind of in clouds, very ethereal, kind of beautiful in a way, almost like when you're up in an airplane. But what struck me, and a little hard to see, on the small screen here, but the water running down the faces of the presidents left for me these metaphorical tears. And I was interested in making a picture. When I went back, I came to know that Rushmore was a long-standing sacred site called Six Grandfathers. And we had violated treaty rights going back to the 19th century, and basically took basically all the land in the Black Hills from the Lakota Nation. And then enabled the construction of this this monument that's deeply revered in our country, but also to make a picture again where you see the consequences. So here first is this violation, but it's how do I even show that physically? And you see all the shot rock, the whole center, the gut of the picture. Is all that shot rock that wasn't going to be going anywhere, where you're, cutting into the whole tree line. And so, this is a complicated picture for me personally, because I went here when I was 13 years old and I had no idea that this was something other than ours. So that stirred up a whole lot of, kind of tumult. So yeah, that's an example.
The amazing thing for me is that I went there, I've been there in the past too, and how much I ignore the shot rock and just look beyond it up to the heads. And so by standing back and putting the rock right at front and center and having to look through the rising clouds or fog to the faces, really brings my attention to that. Of course, you and I have talked about the placement of the flag down in the lower left corner. Speaks to American, not only I'll say, adds further emphasis to that American domination to the site, so that where you see tears, I see sort of crocodile tears, because the US has no intention at all of giving up that site, however many treaties have been broken to take that land. So it's a complex and difficult picture for me for all of those political reasons.
Agreed.
Could you talk about the pony races? Because that's an unusual image where you don't, at least on the front and center, have that notion of dealing with conflict and disagreement.
Well, here, this was somewhat challenging. I mean, it's very challenging, I think, unless one commits to spend, an enormous amount of time to gain access and to have some kind of real meaningful presence on any Indian reservation. But here I'm on Pine Ridge, and I did get to know the founder, Alex Whiteplume, of these commemorative races which take place in June, called the War Pony Races, which commemorate the Lakota win at the Battle of Greasy Grass, Custer's last stand. And so it was a real privilege to see how the community, which is it's a very challenged place. People, the majority of the people on the reservation are living below the poverty level as we define it, but how lifted they are, and how there's something that's carried on here that does relate to traditional rituals within the Lakota people going back centuries. So I really wanted to make a picture that that spoke to that celebration, and they could in some way describe that landscape. So again, the details, all the little, you know, the little groupings of people, it's very hard to see that on the screen here, but they build a kind of narrative in their totality. I hope that there's something about it.
So I think the placement of the image and its relationship to Wounded Knee and so on is an important component to keep in mind.
Yeah, well, I'm only here I'm maybe 10, 15 miles north of Wounded Knee. And a lot of the work that I made here, including the picture that we showed earlier from the Sacred Stone camp, where you see that expansive landscape. I feel that a lot of that the picture like that, and even here to relate to 19th century pictures in terms of the kind of narratives that are implied. In the earlier picture, I think it's important to, when you look at pictures of the massacre of Wounded Knee, and you see the 7th Cavalry all lined up and basically encircling the Indian encampments, it's not that different. And those are the experiences, those wounds remain. And those wounds are what were simmering and so exposed at Standing Rock, and so exposed when I went here to and spent time on Pine Ridge. And it's really quite gut wrenching to just open to those things.
And I want to, if you could, Madeline, just go to the next image. And ask you, we all know about the continuing fires that occur every summer on the West Coast. The Paradise Fire was a particularly difficult one because it wiped out a town in just a few hours. Yet I look at this image and it's so beautiful. It's so balanced. I love it, but I also struggle with it at the same time.
Well, I think it's kind of the embodiment of what looked like it was a perfect life. You know, it's like somebody had this remarkable house, you know, in this California wooded landscape, and they had their sports car and their, you know, baby grand piano and their grill and so on. And there's something very laid bare about what the fire has left behind. And I think I've done this before. If you look at my Biloxi American Power picture, nature, when it comes to the light that it might that illuminates a landscape after the fact of a disaster, it doesn't have any memory of what happened. And so here you have this meeting of this, you know, soft, beautiful early morning light in this kind of, you know, just illuminating, you know, this very ethereal landscape that's a description of this horror, this disaster. To me, it was important to extend the theme of property rights to incorporate where we choose to inhabit the land, knowing that there are tremendous risks, like in forests that should be allowed to free burn, and that the ways they always did. Or with the next image from Louisiana, from the Algiers Point. Can we go to the next slide? Well, here you don't see somebody building on the coastline, but here you see the flooded Mississippi River, kind of at a very meaningful site in New Orleans, where slave ships docked in the 19th century. So that was why, and it was a more minor part of this series, but over the course of these 4 years, and being out in the landscape, I felt it was important to include this material.
To me too, because it draws forth those questions where they're not really direct and clean answers. This is a space where the government built levees to try to protect certain areas, to allow certain areas to develop economically. And in the process of doing that, it created other problems for itself. And it's a lot of these issues are a balance between not two opposing sides, but two sides along a continuum that are all dealing with similar kinds of concerns, maybe from different perspectives. And we create difficulties for ourselves that we have to find our way out of.
Yeah, no, it's when you start to think about these things, they're staggering, and they could really be. It could, sometimes I think it's just impossible the way these things can get resolved. But in the end, I think I'm trying to make pictures that that will lead us to appreciate what we have and how to nurture and cultivate it. So
I want to ask one more question.
Sure.
And that's in relation to the fact, for those of you who are able to come to the museum, this show is paired with another quite remarkable exhibition called Mythmakers, The Art of Winslow, Homer, and Frederick Remington, which you alluded to a little earlier. And what strikes me about both shows is that Homer and Remington really looked at themselves as artists who were making national statements. They were sort of summing up for a public a certain stance that they felt delivered to the needs of the public at that time. This was the turn into the 20th century. In a way, you're doing the same. You're making a national statement. You're making a statement about America or this country at this time. And you've done that also with American Power and with many of your other projects. And I wonder, what's that allure of making that sort of broad cultural statement?
Well, if I set out with that agenda in my head, I would fail. Say that. And even if I had that in my head, period, I would, I'd start walking into walls. It wouldn't be a good thing, John. So I think it's useful for me to start small and to build on the ideas that that provoke me, and to see how far I could take it. With property rights, I didn't realize until, for instance, with COVID and being holed up here in Lower Manhattan, that I would that what would transpire with the murder of George Floyd, and that I would be back out in the street participating in protests as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that that property rights extends in such kind of just troubling ways to the the dark racist side of our society, and that it was really important to extend this series by making pictures at those protests, that it was important to go to Richmond, Virginia, when Monument Avenue was taken over and appropriated by the African American community in a way both joyous and celebratory, but also deeply spiritual, deeply reflective. So in a way, again, it goes back to listening. I think I'm responding to things that kind of call out to me, and to trying to listen to, that those cues, that drum beat. But I'm not starting, I let things, extend and become big, but I really try to stay, very, very specific. So yeah.
Well, you've certainly beautifully captured a society in conflict with itself, and a society struggling with itself. I could continue asking you questions probably for 3 or 4 more hours, but I want to be attendant to time.
Just add one last thing, because I think it's, in the end, as I've drawn these various narratives, to me, what's meaningful is how interconnected they are. How what takes place here in New York, has repercussions in the West, and so it's in understanding and having some kind of perceptual insight into what the meaning is of the relationship between these different series. So on that note, I'll hand it back to you.
I have quite a list of really wonderful questions, if you guys are ready. The first I'll share is from our esteemed director, Andrew Walker, who asked, how did you arrive at the scale of the prints for this exhibition? The immersive quality of the entire exhibition is quite powerful. And additionally, he asked, is scale part of the series' social engagement?
First, Andrew, thanks for being behind the work and helping to make the show happen, and for watching. A kind of an aha moment for me was when I showed American Power at Sycamore Jenkins, and met up with the art historian Michael Fried. And I watched him plant himself in front of the pictures in a way that made clear that he kind of rooted himself to the ground. And it's, because John's asked me about how do I want people to look at the work, and it's a very physical experience. There's a gestalt to the thing as a whole, but like poetry or any work of art on the wall, it's built up with its details. And so what I really try to employ with these large pictures is to have an experience, to create an experience, where there's an engagement with the work, which is moving, and that's part, physical and cerebral, emotive, and that pushes me to make a picture that's worth its space, and that can have the gravitas to hold its own at that scale. First of all, you can't get away with anything that's that's technically deeply flawed. But if the kind of instant allure of scale quickly dissipates if the picture doesn't have depth. So I sort of established this working scale. This is as large as I can make a C print, which is the print medium that I prefer, without seaming. So the prints are made on a piece of photographic roll paper that's 72 inches. So the height is 70, or if I'm working on the vertical, the width, and then the height can be about 90 inches. And it's big enough to achieve what it is that I want. I started working at the scale with American Power, and then I started to work in a very different way, where I was really working more picture to picture, and seeing these works one at a time on the wall, and just spending a lot of time on the printing of them. And also rejecting them if they didn't hold up, if they didn't sort of, weather time.
Along with that question, we have another technical question that kind of relates. Dottie Frank asked, were the images printed in a darkroom or digitally?
My method is I shoot color negative. The film is scanned on a drum scanner. In this case, one that dates back to the early 90s, because that technology reached its pinnacle then. And then the image is worked on in digital space in Photoshop, and then printed on a laser printer called a light jet, on paper that goes into chemistry. So it's kind of a hybrid. It's part analog, optical, and digital. And it involves also the mastery of a printmaker that I work with, or more than one printmaker in the case of this show.
Yeah, and by being chromogenic prints, they still have that sort of luxury of what gelatin brings, that sort of depth to a surface that inkjet hasn't provided to this stage.
Thank you for recognizing that, John. Not everybody does.
Well, I think it's our age. We grew up in that time of gelatin, and the language of gelatin is really a remarkable language for photography.
Yeah, I mean, it's still possible to make an analog print, a mural print, but it would be foolhardy because, in my view, it's foolhardy because the paper is now designed for digital printmaking processes. It's very contrasty, and you have so much possibility to modulate the image in Photoshop and still arrive at a result that is convincingly photographic. And part of that is in how I choose to scan my images. I don't over sharpen them. So there's a kind of subtlety of tone and character that's benefiting from all that I can, do between blending these two processes. Another one?
Yeah, we have a very insightful question from Elizabeth Neely, who asked, your works in this collection seem concerned with boundaries, establishing vantage points to see them and sometimes crossing over them in some way. Over the years, how have you been able to become legitimate in settings where you've crossed boundaries, legitimate in both in your own eyes and in the eyes of others?
I think it's the artist's job to be illegitimate, though. I mean, let's face it. I mean, I'm not making fun of it, but I'm always working against the status quo, and it's, I'm always working against what I already know and what I've done. So if I'm aiming to legitimize the work, then I think I'm really just in some kind of stasis, really treading water. So, I mean, of course, I want the work to be welcomed and to have a public. I'll be, completely sincere about that. But I think I've chosen the path to be an artist because I really cherish the freedom to take risks and to fail. So much of what I do falls flat. It's just what it is. So
Yeah, and I just want to answer that good question another way, and that is that Mitch, as he's already alluded to, goes to a place and spends quite a bit of time oftentimes at a place, walking around, talking with people and so on, to come to terms with the place. It's not here's the Kodak spot to come and make your picture. It's not come and quickly make the picture and go to the next spot. That time really shows in the images. And it shows when you're crossing a cultural line or you're crossing into a community that you're not part of. It's the willingness to take the time to try to understand that community and become accepted on some level. You're always going to be an outsider. But all of those figure into the success of the image.
We've had another question, kind of thinking about the subject and content of your images. Aaron Long asked, do you think that your subjects might consider you a collaborator in these actions? And is that a title you might take on for yourself?
Well, I think in some cases, absolutely. As I alluded to with the Lancaster pictures, I'm asking a lot for those that I approach and sometimes photograph. I'm asking for somebody's trust, and that's a huge responsibility. So, I always approach my subjects with respect, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a point of view or a way of seeing that's my own, that I can assert with my work, with my image making. So, but collaboration, it's to me, I think it's akin to listening and to acknowledging that that every day in my practice and in my life, there are things that that can enable me to break the boundaries that I've established. I mean, and look, I'm one person, so I've got my limits. There's no doubt about it. And I'm sure that I repeat myself all the time. But, as John outlined, the arc of what I've been working on for the last 20 years, it's the path is not absolutely linear. And that's also been really, for me, a gift because it's taken me out of my comfort zone. And that has no doubt involved a lot of collaboration and a lot of trust. I'm working on something now where, and I never know what what's going to happen when I reach out to somebody and ask them to open their door and to share their knowledge and their experience about something. And I'm always grateful and surprised by where it takes me. So that's, I guess, one of the, the real pleasures, the real rewards of doing the kind of work that I do.
And in this project, it's not only the exhibition or the broad series, but I understand that you have a book that's going to come out with about property rights.
Yeah, which is a much more extended representation of the project, and one that also incorporates text, first texts that were drawn from the multiple interviews I did with activists within many of these narratives. And then an essay that I wrote with Susan, who collaborated with me on the editing and writing for the project. You know, I love doing books because I see them as both an enduring thing that I can also have a lot of control over. And I really think of a book in a way, you know, really no different than an exhibition. It's something. It's a certain way to tell the story of the work. So yeah, so the book will be out. Well, COVID permitting, end of late spring, early summer.
Yeah, for me, a book is very different from an exhibition, particularly when you have prints so large, because it's a much more intimate experience. And it's much more an experience about sequencing, going from page to page, and the text starts to become, it's a different kind of text and it's a different kind of experience. So I look forward to the book simply because it's going to be another angle or take on this involved project.
Thank
And
you.
I just included a link for those who are still joining us to be able to follow up and read a little bit more about the book. And you can also pre-order it there too, if you're interested. If you guys are up for 2 more questions, go a tiny bit over on time. But John, I know you had a request from someone about talking a little bit on the Tree of Life photograph.
Yeah, if you could bring that up.
I'd love to.
I got a question before we got together from somebody who couldn't come tonight, just asking you to speak about how this image fit within your notion of property rights in this series.
So this image was made at the Tree of Life Synagogue, which is on Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I felt the calling as an American Jew after the massacre of the 11 people who died and to the hands of a bigoted, racist, you know, maniac, to go and to spend some time at this kind of de facto memorial that was set up outside the synagogue. So, you know, how does it fit? Again, it fits in the sense that, well, what do we see here? We see, you know, these caution police lines do not cross. You see at this point in time, this temple for prayer is cordoned off for an FBI investigation. But what are the rights of property? What are the rights of private property? What are our rights to be able to conduct worship, to have individual libertarian rights to do the things that we should be free to do? And so this was a tremendous personal affront to me. But also, why did I go there? I mean, I think, maybe just weeks before that I saw in a plane, Would You Be My Neighbor? The documentary portrait of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. And it was just felt also so profoundly ironic that, in his neighborhood, this place that, that was this sort of symbol of brotherhood, of community, that this kind of, racial, bigoted kind of trespass could occur. And so again, it was like, well, I made several pictures, mostly of actually the people in reflection at this memorial. But here, I was struck by the way in which this sort of bouquet of flowers all of a sudden look like they're kind of growing right out of the earth at the foot of this pine tree with the synagogue behind, and it just felt very evocative. And it's a little unnerving, but also beautiful at a large scale. So it was, again, one of the ways that I extended the narrative or the definition of property rights.
Yeah, in a way, it's a landscape. It's one gets pulled into those flowers. It's such a horrific scene, but one can't help but be pulled in to look at all the detail of those flowers.
All right, we have time for one last question, and I quite like this one that we got from Ryan. Hi, Mitch. Thank you for providing such an illuminating talk this evening. I'm interested in how your projects emerge out of personal experience in combination with critical research. I was wondering how you approach the research stage of your practice. Do you have a research question? Is there a thesis in mind? I was hoping you could speak a bit about the similarities and differences between conventionally academic research and your photographic research.
Well, this question is really more from my researcher, my cohort, Ryan, because I have to sort of like, sort of weave something into his brain to kind of deconstruct what the process is. Like all research, you start with a, say with a, I don't know what you call, like a word to do a Google search or a title or whatever. And it's fascinating. I mean, the world of knowledge and information is so deep, and one thing often leads to another. And sometimes you just kind of go down a rabbit hole, and it's useless. And even with many of the things on the map, that's the case. But what's useful about the research is that it'll call my attention to something, and then I'll follow it over time. So an example would be, I became aware of the resistance action in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii, where indigenous Hawaiians were taking a stand to stop the construction of the world's largest telescope on Mauna Kea. And it was really an incredible story, and it was a bit like, what's been going on with the volcanoes in Hawaii. It was pretty, it was a small story and not a whole lot was happening. But in 2019, it escalated to the point where indigenous Hawaiian elders actually blocked the road. And so it was the research that called my attention to it, but it was also the ability to keep up with the news as it's reported from Hawaii that enabled me to follow this and to realize that last October, a year and a half ago, it was the time to go. And I'm really glad I did, because with COVID, the resistance action ended. So this image, you see one of the activists there, and on this lava field, living out of his car, he's sort of laying the foundation on what looks like it might be an unlivable landscape to build a structure. Yeah, it's, the thing is, I'll end by saying something that was spoken to me by Susan Sontag at a Pina Bausch performance. And I had met her early on and wasn't really a friend of hers, but she knew my work well enough to say to me, Mitch, cultivate your eccentricities, okay? Eccentricities, idiosyncrasies, just the thing that you just don't know about. You don't know where it leads you. And I think that that's what's kind of thrilling and essential to the process of research, being open to ideas, to where you might get led that you had no idea you would get to. So that's the beauty of it for me. I hope I didn't name drop with her, but it was just something that stayed with me.
It was a nice way to end our chat this evening. So thank you very much, Mitch and John, for being here this evening virtually. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I know there were a few that we didn't get to, and I'm really sorry about that, but we're already over for time. If you have a few minutes before you sign off, I'm sending a survey in the chat, and we would very much appreciate you taking a couple of minutes of your time to fill out a survey for the museum. This 2-minute survey will provide us with information about who you are and what you would like to see more of from the Carter. And your feedback will help us plan future programming and potentially acquire grant funding as well. So again, the link is in the chat, but you'll also receive it in an email tomorrow morning. So thank you guys very much for your time on the survey. And thanks, Mitch and John. This was a very, very enlightening and moving discussion.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, John. And
thanks, Madeline and Mitch, for joining us tonight. And thank you, everybody who's come to listen and provide questions and your own thoughts.
Me too. Yeah. Really appreciate it. Stay safe and stay warm, especially those of you in Fort Worth.
Yeah, and those of you in this area, if you haven't come seen the show, certainly come see it. It's up until the end of the month. And I just remind you that the museum is open free to the public. Yes. So it's an easy thing to do. And seeing these images in person is a very different experience than seeing them on screen. Thank you so much.
Very well said, John. Thank you both again. Good night, everyone. Stay warm.
Bye. Thanks.